Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about economy, and I have Professor Elvan Aktas, Professor of Finance from Georgia, United States. He's an expert on Turkish economy as well. But today we'll be talking about overall Turkish economy, since the beginning of the early republic, how the cycle goes and how does it look at the moment. Because Professor Aktas has written a recent article which is titled "The Rise and the Fall of the Turkish Economic Success: The Story Under AK Party, Justice and Development Party." The article looks in detail over the cycles of right-wing and left-wing parties and how they manage economy and how the cycles goes in Turkey, and try to give a picture of what might be expecting us. Welcome, Professor Aktas. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. In your article, you start quite early. Why do you start quite early? Isn't the current modern governance system is quite different, and economic parameters, the stock market and everything, doesn't it require a separate access? Why would you want to start to examine Turkish economy from the beginning?
Well, it's an excellent question. The tools and maybe the actors are different. Maybe the financial system is adapted to the global modern financial system. But if you look deep down, the structural problems of the Turkish economy and the transformation sociologically, the transformation of the society, and of course the resulting political upswings and downturns are all the same. In fact, I argue that this coming crisis, that if it hasn't happened yet, to some extent, is actually probably the sixth or seventh one since the modern republic has been established in 1923.
Well, that is quite against the what we have discussed so far. We have always assumed that AK Party government has been very successful in terms of economic, market statistics, especially in their first two terms up to 2010, 2011. But what you're saying is actually no. It is a cycle that can be predicted. There has been always ups and downs. Can you give some example for that, for instance?
Let me use a simple example that I use for my undergraduate students. It's one of the tricks in investments that we use. It's a simple mathematic trick. If you buy a stock for $100 and if it dives to 50, your loss is 50%. But for your stock to actually recover back to where you started at 100, from 50 to 100, you have to now go up 100%. So what I mean by that is actually all these cycles that I've been talking about earlier, and I address in the paper as well, is that most of the time these conservative governments that represent the right central majority in the political spectrum usually gain power, or they win elections after a horrific economic crisis. And those economic crises usually are literally aligned in history. If you look at the history of the political cycles of the modern Republic of Turkey and the history of the economic cycles, they are perfectly correlated. Usually these centrist right conservative parties gain power after horrific economic crises caused by draconian, almost totalitarian measures by the elite that we call the Kemalist, or that represent the status quo of the state. So that's why it is, one could argue that the economic situation before AK Party gained power was so bad, just merely having political stability. And of course, you have to also align this with the global forces, which is even a stronger argument in my paper.
What do you mean
If
by
you remember,
global forces? Is that like the you're not talking surely about interest lobby that Erdogan talks. What do you mean by
no, no,
global?
no, no, no. No, I'm a financial economist. I'm looking at the flow of money. And when I say global cycles, remember in 2008 and 2009, the worst financial disaster of human history happened in the United States. Yes, it did not cause an economic crisis at the global scale like the Great Depression of the 1930s era. But if you look at the numbers of the devastation of the loss of financial wealth, it was nothing comes close in the history of humankind. So what I mean by that is in 2008 and 9, developed economies were looking at safe havens in the developing markets to pour that money as investment so that they could get some return. And Turkey, under AK Party regime, presented an amazing, invaluable safe haven as a Muslim democratic country trying to engage with the European Union in its bid to become a full-fledged member. That was amazingly valuable because Turkey was presenting an investment alternative which was 3-4 times better than anything in the developed world, but also an emerging market. So that money poured into Turkey, which AK Party not so wisely did not use for education, did not use for infrastructure projects. Rather, they invested all that money into construction of homes and office buildings and shopping malls, which is usually a very typical, I should say, a symptom of developing economies when they mismanage their investments.
Okay, let me summarize it for the listeners. What you're trying to say, if I'm wrong, correct me please, is that the economic crisis in 2002 or before AK Party was so bad that when Erdogan take power, and the fact that they were able to offer political stability was a good thing. Then it gave a good impact on the market with good policies that they followed probably from the previous special administration from Kemal Dervish and others. Maybe a credit to them as well in there. However, it may be nasty in terms of tightening economy and stuff. But then it was given an extra impetus in 2008 and 9 with the American crisis, where loads of dollars went away into safe haven. You mean like safer developing countries, which Turkey
Yes.
was one of them. So what we're seeing after 2008 actually is an injection, an extra unexpected injection to the economy, which explains part of the success after then. So until when this continued, like when is the things start turning other way?
The peak was 2010. In fact, in 2010, Turkey had an annual growth of GDP of 11%, second to China only in the whole world. The reason for that was, as you mentioned, that money was pouring into the country. But the question for developing economies is, what do you do with that money? If you use it for infrastructure projects, if you use it to expand your production capacity so that you can use it for exports, if you invest it into the education R&D projects, so you try to actually literally create an economic model that will be sustainable when that money runs out. But the Turkish government, AK Party, didn't do that. And there are two reasons why they did that. Typical, and in my paper, typical of any conservative, centrist right-wing party of Turkey, which heavily relies on the migration from the rural areas into the cities, which literally stopped in the early 2010s in Turkey because the population, the demographics is changing. Number one, there aren't enough people coming from the village side, countryside to the cities. Number two, Turkey is also aging now. Turkey is not that young, vibrant society where people have 2-3 children. I mean, families are smaller. People don't have children because now mom and dad also work. These are all things that are changing in the demographics of the country, sociologically, politically, and of course, as a result, economically. So the decline started in 2012. And it is, again, no accident, these global forces, and when I say, I don't mean as a conspiracy theory, all these global evil outsiders, I mean literally the money started flowing back to the developed markets. In 2012-13, United States Federal Reserve policies, they started seeing the upswing in the market towards the end, or actually, I should say, the beginning of the second Obama term, and Europe started also seeing some signs of production capacity increases. And then there were other pockets of the world where China started slowing down, for example. India started slowing down. Oil prices started slipping, and all the commodity prices started slipping down. And Turkey just got caught unprepared because the AK Party government did not do the right thing with the money that came to the country.
Regardless, 2011, 12, and now we're in 17, 5 years ahead. So it might be the Turkish economy was very strong. It was able to resist so far. Then is that what you mean? Like since 2012, economy is not that good, but good enough to remain? Or is there any other reason that somehow protected Turkish economy?
Well, again, from a demographics point of view, although Erdogan and AK Party would love to use the Syrian refugees as a blackmail tool for Europe, but what happened was you have an injection of 3 million people from Syria. That's an enormous cheap labor pouring into a country where industrial production could not find enough cheap labor. And many of those undocumented workers have no benefits whatsoever. You can hire them with almost like comparable to the Chinese labor in the 90s. It is so cheap. So that extended the collapse of the system. Another one was also that at the same time,
that delayed the collapse of the system?
Yes,
because low workforce, plus maybe some of the housing market was benefited from this, maybe in Istanbul especially.
Of course, if you go to any cities, like for example, I have friends from Turkey who tell me that in Antep, in Maraş, in Istanbul, in Izmir, you're gonna find these neighborhoods, rough neighborhoods, where 3-4 Syrian families would actually rent a flat and pay twice, 3 times the rent that normally a Turkish family would pay. So that is a delaying factor. The second, maybe even more important delaying factor is the slowdown in China and in India. So that still gave the surplus economies in the Middle East, especially Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they want to convert their dollars, the surplus, into something other than almost 0% yielding US treasury bonds. So they need to put that money in some place, which they chose Turkey as for their prime real estate investments. So there was still some money coming in, but not into the production cycle, but rather into the rentier cycle, what we call is just simply a real estate bubble right now, which is building a lot worse in Turkey in the last 2 years than ever before. That's why the country does not see inflation numbers in as bad as in the 90s, but the last number that was announced yesterday by even the official number is 11.3%. Which is horrendous if you think about what has happened to Turkey when it had double-digit inflations in the past.
Okay, I want to talk, really, I'm tempted to talk about the housing market bubble, but I'm holding myself because I want to keep this informative and short, so I'll leave it for another time. But one last question. Having seen all these things, and there is an upcoming referendum where people are quite polarized in terms of yes and no. What do you think will happen? Is that a good scenario for yes and bad scenario for no, or other way? How do you see what would happen in 17th of April, and which outcome would be better for Turkish economy?
Very simple. All the arguments that I just presented, which are the consensus among the academics and as well as the practitioners in the banking industry in Turkey, all of them are historical and structural. Until Turkey actually addresses these structural problems of the economic growth or sustainability of the economic growth, none of them will go away. Political cycles only, and of course the global forces, the availability of the funds from the global financial markets, only delay the cycles. So what I think about the outcome of the election is it's not going to make any difference whatsoever economically.
So either yes or no won't really change a lot. It will be still better.
Well, let's say that you have a patient.
So the decline will continue, let's say.
Well, I would say that you have a patient in the ER. You don't worry about the color of his shirt. There is a bleeding that needs to be stopped.
I see. Thank you very much. It was very, very descriptive. Thank you very much. We'll hopefully see you again, and would like to listen more about especially the housing market bubble in the future. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Aktas, and have a nice day in the United States.
It was a pleasure. Have a nice day too.